So I thought it was a take it or leave it deal. But it keeps changing. We'll get to that in just a couple of minutes here on the Trent England Show. Thank you for joining me this Tuesday morning. And we're going to talk about the latest on this big tax hike proposal that is kicking around in the state capitol here in Oklahoma City. But before we get to that, and all the twists and turns of these supposedly take it or leave it, here it is. Take it or leave it. Well, you don't like this one? We'll change it. Well, we'll change it some more. We'll drop out all the reforms that we were trying to use to entice conservatives to be a part of the process. Hey, we'll get there. We'll get there. First of all, a couple of updates on things that we have been following. This was mostly back when we were on the radio, but news out of the Middle East. Vice President Pence said yesterday that the U.S. will move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem by the end of next year. So putting a timeline on all of that. And I have to note that the BBC reporting on this is emblematic of most of the reporting on this, which is abysmal, terrible. Really, either the reporters don't know their history or they're trying to mislead people. It's funny. The other day on Twitter, I was responding to something irresponsible that someone said, and I said, I'm guessing you didn't read this, and he got very offended. Of course I read it. I said, well, I was giving you the benefit of the doubt. How is that giving me the benefit of the doubt? Well, I told him, I said I was assuming that, if you had read it, you would understand it and you wouldn't lie to people about it. So he didn't. I don't know. Some people don't understand that oftentimes ignorance is probably the most innocent explanation here. But the BBC reporting contains this line. You see this in almost every story about Jerusalem. You see this same line, something almost exactly like this. The BBC says, Israel regards Jerusalem as its eternal and undivided capital, while the Palestinians claim East Jerusalem. And then they say this, occupied by Israel in the 1967 Middle East War as the capital of a future state. Every time you read that, and I see this, I think literally every story about this issue of where the U.S. Embassy is going to be contains a line like that always makes it sound like Israel fought this aggressive war and seized this territory, including East Jerusalem, back in 1967, and never, ever, ever do they acknowledge, do they admit the basic history of that, which was, it was one of the many attempts of Israel's neighbors to drive the state of Israel, into the sea, right? To eradicate the Jewish people from the area that is Israel. And yet Israel's so successful in that fighting that they seized East Jerusalem, much to the chagrin of the people who started the war. Anyhow, I just have to point all that out. We've been following the twists and turns in that because it's a fascinating story, because it gets to what I predict will, I don't know, maybe there are some people out there already calling it this, but what I think is going to become known as the Trump Doctrine in foreign policy, which is to just do things that the American people and that the United States is supposedly committed to doing, just actually do them and follow through on them, and not get all caught up in these endless wars of words or this saber rattling by some of our most pathetic adversaries out there abroad. And this is a good example where people who actually want to go out and commit violent acts because the U.S. Embassy is going to be in one place rather than another, right, actually really look silly when you put them to the test. So anyhow, that's the latest. Putting a timeline on all that is, I think, good news. After all, we have a law that Congress passed and President Clinton signed that says that we should do that, right? So, hard to actually blame Donald Trump for carrying out the policy decisions made by Congress and a former president. Our freedom update this morning comes from. So we talk about these stories where people don't have freedom because these are the most important stories. If we want, if we want our young people or anybody else to understand the Middle East, they've got to know the history of the Middle East. If we want to value our freedom, if we want young people to value our freedom, they have to understand that it's not some birthright. It's not something that everybody just is as fat, dumb, and happy as they want to be around the rest of the world. And to do that, we go first to China, where the New York Times actually reports on a dissident who is actually a Swedish citizen, ethnically Chinese, but a Swedish citizen, which is an interesting twist on all of this, who has disappeared. And of course, when somebody disappears in China, very often, and the reports here are that this is the case, they're seized by the police. This again, ethnically Chinese person, but a person who has Swedish citizenship, was reportedly seized, taken, and is now incommunicado. Nobody knows where he is. Seized by the Chinese police for his criticism. He's been arrested in the past for being involved with people who criticize the Chinese regime, and of course, we have an outpost of the Chinese regime, the Chinese Communist Party, right here in the great state of Oklahoma, right down, south. So south is that way from me where I am in the studio right now. So just down south of here, not that far, 30 miles or so, there is an outpost of the communist Chinese government, right? The same government that seizes people, throws them into prison, no charges, no due process, no communication, no right to an attorney. That same regime funds a Chinese study program called the Confucius Institute down at the University of Oklahoma. And so, every once in a while, when something pops up in the news about China, I go to the website of the Confucius Institute, and I do a web search, and I look, let's see if students in Norman studying at the Chinese Communist Party, Chinese government-supported Confucius Institute down at OU, let's see what they can learn about issues of due process in China, because obviously this is a big, some people, I suppose, think that maybe they shouldn't be randomly kidnapping people off the streets, right? Due process seems like it should be an issue. If we're going to talk about China, we're going to talk about contemporary China, obviously we should study due process. And so I did the web search, the Confucius Institute at OU, and due process, and you can see what I came up with. Nothing. I guess maybe the Chinese Communist government you think they fund these programs like the one at the University of Oklahoma? You think they fund them so that they can have some control? No, they would never do. They would never try to exercise control of public perception of China. They would never try to stifle debate. And after, who in Norman, Oklahoma, who at the University of Oklahoma, with a modicum of self-respect, would accept money from the Chinese communist regime if it was controlling what they say or do or think or teach there? Except that when you go to the website, you can't find anything about due process. What about corruption? We've talked about corruption in China before, and actually the latest communist government corruption story is actually out of Vietnam. This is an interesting, it's kind of an interesting story because you never know in these countries whether people are actually corrupt or they're not corrupt, whether some of the people are corrupt and some of the people are being roped in because they're simply critical of the regime, or they've lost favor with somebody in the regime. There's no transparency in Vietnam. Sometimes people forget, Vietnam is a communist country, a serial human rights abuser to this day, but they're having these mass corruption trials. They have sentenced at least one person to death and another person to life in prison in Vietnam. And it got me thinking. We've covered on the radio program in the past, our erstwhile Trent England radio program, some of the interesting stories out of China about the fact that barrels of oil just disappear from the statistics, or they appear but they're not in the statistics. That was one of my favorite programs we ever did, was talking about these missing barrels of oil in China, because we know, again, if we know our history, and I've got the book I think right behind me in the studio here, Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago. actually describes in Soviet Russia the process by which the human, very human nature reasons why in a communist system where you have state-controlled, top-down orchestrated production, where the state controls the means of production, what the Bernie bros want, or at least, what Bernie Sanders used to want back in the late 70s and 80s, right? When you do that, you actually create a system that is almost inherently corrupt because, it trickles down, right? People make things up in order to satisfy the production quotas, and then every so often, this is the way it would work in the Soviet Union, every so often you have a big mass trial because they have to kind of reset the numbers, right? They have to at some point recalibrate the whole system, and then they start again from, something like honest numbers, and gradually year by year they accumulate more and more fraud. So this seems to be what's going on in Vietnam right now, playing out there. So I went to the website of the Confucius Institute because corruption's a big issue in China. They have big challenges. The state acknowledges that. They've been having prosecutions in China for corruption as well. So I searched the Confucius Institute at the University of Oklahoma for the word corruption. Can you study anything, find out anything about corruption in modern China from the Confucius Institute? And of course, the answer is did not match any documents. And, note here, this is an ou.edu. This is an Oklahoma State education website, right? Your tax dollars commingled with money from the communist Chinese regime. We might put it that way. Does that bother you? Right? The legislature of the great state of Oklahoma should do something about this. They've done it in other states. And the University of Texas has refused to accept this money from the Chinese government. It's funneled through a foundation in China, but they've refused to accept this money after taking some political pressure. I think that the University of Texas would have taken the money if not for political pressure from people like Ted Cruz and from many other political figures, leaders in the state of Texas. And can we get that kind of leadership in the state of Oklahoma? Maybe, hopefully, we'll see. Okay. The latest on the big tax hike proposal kicking around in Oklahoma City. As I said at the beginning, I thought this was supposed to be a take it or leave it deal. You remember when, back in December, there were these rumors circulating, and some of them in the press, but of course the press figure who's involved in all this had promised only good coverage and promised not to talk about the fact that they were meeting behind the scenes and not to criticize any of that. But there were all these rumors swirling around about all. It was going to be this package, and it was going to be some tax hikes, and conservatives want limited government, but they've got to give up something if they want these reforms. Because, obviously, Oklahoma is a swing state, really narrowly divided. So if conservatives want something, you got to give something to the liberals, right? I don't know. But, they were gonna buy conservative support with all of these reforms. Reforms included things like school choice, right? Something that, some states, states like Nevada, some other states have really gone down this road. Arizona of trying to aggressively provide as many choices, as much customized education to students as possible. And Oklahoma's done some good things. We have some great programs. We have the Lindsay Nicole Henry Scholarship Program. We have tax credit scholarships here. But we don't have anything beyond that, anything that's more universal than that. And so that was going to be a part of this deal, right? School choice, some education reforms, and judicial reform, right? Oklahoma is in this weird situation where we have a state judiciary that is far, far to the left. And also we have these lines that are based on 1967 Oklahoma population. We got all this weird stuff. So we were going to get some judicial reform. So for conservatives who are concerned about constitutional law and constitutional fidelity, we're going to get some of that. We were going to get some reforms to the executive branch. And it was going to be all of that. And then it was going to be some tax increases. And it was going to be, the big cigarette tax hike. We've talked about that on the program before. It was going to be a gas and diesel fuel tax increase. We talked about that a little bit before. It was going to be gross production tax increases to some level in some way. And then maybe kind of little income tax increases, but little, and they kind of kept that from coming to light until actually just this week. Any details of any of that. But as it came out a couple of weeks ago, this was going to be a take it or leave it deal. And the first thing a lot of people noticed was, wait a second, they dropped out some of the big reforms. They dropped out any education reforms that would customize education more to students. All that went by the wayside. So I guess you see, the liberals in Oklahoma, they really have the power, right? Conservatives can't ask for that much in a state like Oklahoma. I mean, it's not like Oklahoma's that conservative of a state, right? Where conservatives should get these, actually, come to think of it, when you look at the makeup of the legislature, you might think these reforms would pass on their own, and that you wouldn't have to buy off any votes with bigger government and big tax hikes. But yeah, I don't know. I guess, what am I missing here? But, then it was going to be a take it or leave it deal. So maybe it was a take it or leave it deal before, but now they dropped out some of the conservative reforms. Now they have a take it or leave it deal. Except, even when it first came out, there were no details of the income tax hike, and then details of the income tax hike came out, and now we've got a take it or leave it deal. And but they still didn't put all the details out there in front of the public. And I had a journalist asking me, well, what do you think about that? I said, all the details aren't here. I mean, how do you evaluate something before they've given you all the details, especially when they're saying this is the final deal, this is their take it or leave it deal? And now we heard yesterday a whole bunch of the details are changing again. And in the governor's call, not all of the reforms are included. I'm told that judicial reform is now off the table, right? So no education reform, no judicial reform. I mean, as we go along, do we see where this is going? As we move through the process, all that is really left are the tax hikes, which some people predicted a long time ago about this whole process. The problem is, right, it's being driven by people who want the tax hikes, right? And they're trying to buy people into the process with the idea of these reforms. But at the end of the day, the people driving the bus want tax increases. They don't want the reforms. They don't. That's not why they're doing this, right? I'm not saying that in a pejorative way. It's just the truth. They're doing this because they want big tax increases. Governor Fallon has made increasing taxes, especially cigarette taxes, but also taxes overall. She has made that her signature issue in her second term in office. Just like Brad Henry made cutting the income tax his signature issue in his second term in office, right? Governors are looking for something to do as people start calling them lame ducks. Governor Brad Henry had these two massive income tax cuts, and Governor Mary Fallon wants a massive cigarette tax increase, and she wants some of these other tax increases as well, some of them just to buy votes for her cigarette tax increase, and some of them, I think, because she wants to go out with this idea that the government is running these big surpluses, which is funny, by the way, because surpluses, we described this, I think we described this last week on the show. Surpluses or shortfalls are caused by economic activity. They're not caused by tax rates. And you do know that, right? Because the projection, right? Politicians always spend all the money. It's one of Trent's primary rules of how government works. Politicians always spend all the money. So when you raise tax rates, then the people who make the predictions about how much money is going to come into government, they predict that government will take in more money. The politicians spend all that money. The only way you have a budget revenue surplus is when the economy does better than what's predicted. And the only reason you have a shortfall is because the economy does worse, or because the politicians spent, one-time funds in the past, which in Oklahoma is that's very muddy waters, because there's a lot of one-time funds that come in every year. So tell me how is that one-time funds, right? Those aren't one-time funds. But anyhow, some are, some aren't. So what's the latest with this big tax increase proposal that is out there? Well, one thing that's interesting to know, before I get in, I want to get into a couple of the details here that came out yesterday. But one thing I will point out, there are a lot of people in Oklahoma running for governor, and I haven't seen it. Now send me a message or leave it in the comments if you've seen something different than what I've seen. I have not seen a single candidate for governor endorse this plan. Not a single one. Last week, Todd Lamb was out saying absolutely no to the tax increases in this plan, and praising the people who put it together, praising some of these reform ideas, right? But not falling prey to this idea that somebody's going to put a what would be called in the law an adhesion contract, right? The take it or leave it deal. If you break this seal, you agree to all of the details of this contract in 6-point type, right? Not falling prey to that. And then yesterday, Mick Cornett came out and said basically, a lot of the same things. Said praised some of the reforms, praised the people who are behind all of this, but said the tax increases, basically don't make sense to him right now. That it's not his inclination, I think, to raise taxes. And of course, Drew Edmondson on the other side of the aisle came out and said actually pretty much the same thing about some of the reforms, at least some of the reforms that are left that would make the governor stronger in the state of Oklahoma, which I think is a good thing. It seems like everybody on both sides supports those reforms. It makes sense if you're running for governor, but I think they make sense otherwise as well. But he said the tax increases are too low, at least the gross production tax. He said, that he's not even for the tax plan here because he wants it to be bigger. And so nobody running for governor is actually supporting this proposal, which is interesting, right? I mean, ask yourself, for the people saying, again, right, the poll that really matters, and the people running for governor know this, the poll that really matters is the poll that happens on Election Day. And it is so fascinating when we get people who actually are expecting to be held accountable to voters, who are going to go before voters and ask for their vote, when they look at a proposal like this and they say, I don't want to hitch my wagon to this, that maybe tells us something about the other claims, right? That people are they're just dying for a tax increase in Oklahoma. I don't know, maybe not. So what do we have here? I do want to say, I've got to say this because I've been really critical of the Oklahoman over this, but I want to give Randy Ellis a big shout out on the program. He's got the bottom of the front page in the Oklahoman this morning, and he gets it exactly right on the state question that's out there, right? I have criticized this. Hopefully he's listening to the show or watching the show, and he got this from us. I've been stirring this up because it had been reported that the state question, so you've got the big tax hike proposals being pushed in the legislature, and then you have this state question out there that potentially could start gathering signatures here once it gets through the legal challenge process, if it gets through the legal challenge process. And people were saying that it would raise the gross production tax on new wells to 7%. And I pointed out over and over again, it's not true. It would add 5% to whatever the gross production tax rate was on new wells. That sounds wonky, but it's really important when people are asking the legislature to take it from 2 to 4%. 2% plus 5 is 7%, sure, but 4% plus 5 is 9%. I know you're saying, come on, Trent, that's basic math. But the media kept getting that wrong. Finally, as of today, is the first time I think I've seen a media report mentioning this that actually got this exactly right. So big shout out to Randy Ellis for getting that right. So that's important to understand what's really going on here. Yesterday, the details of the gross production tax increase plan changed. And the group that was pushing this state question gross production tax increase said for the first time, well, maybe we'll back off that. Maybe we won't push this plus 5% gross production tax increase on the ballot because of some of the changes to the tax hike package being pushed at the legislature. So what's going on? This gives us a window into what's going on with this big tax hike package. And, people have been asking themselves, and legislators have been, I think, complaining, I think it's fair to say that last year, the last couple of years, you had people here in Oklahoma City, people up at the state capitol saying, don't you dare raise taxes on oil and gas companies, right? These are they're part of the backbone of our economy in Oklahoma City and Oklahoma generally, right? Why would you kick them when they're down? Why would you raise this? They just had a compromise deal in 2014 that set these rates. Why would we go back and tinker with that compromise that everybody was supposedly happy with at the time? And you have people like me out there saying, who cares about any of the interest groups involved in this? Why would we hitch our wagon more firmly to the revenue source in Oklahoma that goes violently up and violently down due to things totally outside of our control? So you had all of these arguments against the gross production tax, and all of a sudden you have some of the same people who said, don't you dare take our taxes from 2% to 4%, all of a sudden turning around saying, you better take our taxes to 4%. You're not a patriotic Oklahoman if you don't raise our taxes to 4%. And of course, it's because they were scared of this state question that might have gone on the ballot that would raise their taxes from 2% not to 4%, but to 7%, or potentially, as we pointed out, potentially to 9% or something like that. All of this going on in the background here. And look, it's important. I'm not criticizing anybody who is standing up for their own interest in Oklahoma's economy, right? We expect people to do that. We expect people to go to bat for their, for what they do and for how they earn their living. And that's all fair and well and good, as long as it's done in a way that's honest and open and not disingenuous. That's all perfectly understandable. But the reality with the changes yesterday, and I haven't seen a new breakdown yet of this big tax hike proposal, but just like the conservative reforms have mostly been gutted from this proposal, now we have it shifting. I mean, as far as I can tell, the changes that were suggested yesterday, I can't imagine that any of those changes made the total amount of revenue that would come in from gross production tax higher. It looked like all the changes would make that revenue come in lower when it comes in. Of course, when oil prices tank, then it doesn't come in at all, which is why this whole conversation is so foolish. But from what I've seen, all of these changes are gradually pushing the burden of the proposed tax increase bundle more and more to middle and lower class Oklahomans. Because what did we mention at the beginning, right? The core to this is a massive cigarette tax hike and a tax on gasoline and diesel, a tax on the fuel that people put in their gas tanks. And those are regressive taxes. Everybody understands those are regressive taxes. And when it comes to the cigarette tax, it's also a revenue source that we expect to see declining. But those are regressive taxes, right? And the more that these other things come down, are reduced, right, the more the burden in this package is shifting toward poor and middle class Oklahomans. And that's the latest. That's the update on all of that. We'll keep following it here on the Trent England Show. And just telling you what's going on, right? I mean, you can do whatever you want with that information, but people should understand what's actually going on. After all, theoretically, it's our government. It doesn't belong even to the people we elect, let alone to various special interest groups out there. So that's the latest. Closing the show this morning, have to mention one thing because it confirms something I think I said yesterday morning on the program. I was excited to see, it didn't make the headline, but it's in the story, front page, top of the Oklahoman this morning, a Ben Felder story about a survey that the Oklahoma Department of Education did of people who are certified teachers in Oklahoma who are not teaching in Oklahoma right now, and they asked them why. And obviously pay is a big issue. It's the biggest issue in the survey. But it's not the only issue in the survey, and it's not the biggest issue by far. As we said it just the other day, and I've said it many times before, because this is what I hear from teachers in Oklahoma. They want to be able to teach. They want to be able to do their job. They don't want to be meddled with constantly. They don't want to have the testing regimes, the curriculum changing all the time, which is exactly the opposite interest of the interest in a state bureaucracy or a federal bureaucracy. Follow me on this as we end the Trent England Show for this morning. There's nobody in the state bureaucracy, let alone the federal bureaucracy, that calls itself the Department of Education, that educates anybody. All they can do is micromanage, right? Their self-esteem, this is not a criticism, it's an observation. This is how human nature works. You put me in the Department of Education, I'd feel the same way. I'd be hard-pressed to do anything different. Because if you work there, you don't get to educate kids. right? And frankly, a lot of people work in those settings because they thought they wanted to be teachers. They thought they wanted to be educators, and then they realized they didn't like it very much. So they get a job telling teachers what to do. They get a job mucking around in the business of education without actually doing, rolling up their sleeves and doing the hard work. I guess that is a little pejorative, but I'll stick with it. The more state bureaucracy we have, the more federal bureaucracy we have, the more people we have who have an interest in micromanaging and meddling in education without actually teaching and being responsible for the education of students. So it's ironic, although helpful, that the Oklahoma Department of Education has come out with this survey saying, look, what a lot of teachers want is just to be supported and allowed to do their job. And I mean, I have been a supporter of a pay raise for teachers in Oklahoma for years, pretty much the whole time I've been here. I think it would be wonderful to pay teachers more. I think that pay should be delivered through merit pay, and I think that pay should be set at the school district level with lots of transparency, but I think it should be set, the decision should be made at the school district level. But if legislators really want to help teachers, do something for teachers that doesn't cost anything and probably saves money in the long run, it might be hard to save money doing this in year one, but it certainly would save money over time. Reduce the bureaucracy, reduce the unfunded mandates, reduce the mandates, period, whether they're funded or not, and let school districts and schools and teachers get back to the job of teaching. And that is, while they want to focus on the money, everybody wants to focus on the money. When you read into the story this morning, that is a big part of what's going on in Oklahoma's public schools. I'm Trent England. Thank you for watching the Trent England Show today. Go to Facebook or YouTube, share the program, comment on the program, send me your thoughts, your questions, whatever you want to know. By the way, I will be in Washington, D.C. the next couple of days. I think we're going to have a recorded program tomorrow morning on school choice with Brandon Dutcher and myself that we will record before I fly out to Washington, D.C. And then I'll be back on Friday. We may do the show at a different time on Friday. We'll let you know on our Facebook page, and I'll let you know what's the latest from Washington, D.C. when I get back. Thanks so much for watching the Trent England Show.